Okay, so you did begin to explore Islam beyond the surface level. When you did, what did you discover?
Well, even at that time, I knew that churches were being burnt in Aceh. And that when Christians were placed in schools as teachers...
let's just... The assumption is, I'm hearing, that was like a jihad burning. Is that right? Like Muslims are burning, is it? Or
yes, Muslims are burning churches.
Right.
So they say, why is there a church here? It's offensive to us.
Right, okay, sorry. Yep.
And in fact, a major kind of Protestant church in Banda Aceh had been burnt down, and then they couldn't get a permit to rebuild it.
Right.
And actually, the village I lived in the 60s, there was a famous massacre of communists across Indonesia. Hundreds of thousands were killed. But in Aceh, Muslim youth groups killed non-Muslims. And in the village where I lived, the head of the village, whose mother I lived with, he and his mates, then back there in the 60s, which was only 10 years before I was there, they'd gone and killed all the local Chinese. And the mother talked me through in graphic detail what she'd heard about that. So I was living in the home and the family of people who had killed Christians. And then I was worshipping with those Christians, the Chinese that survived in the town. And they'd say, oh, where are you living? And I'd say, I'm living in this man's house. And they'd go, you can just tell.
Wow.
You know. So there was this, it was an interesting, I was being welcomed. They were happy to have me. But I was aware that there was this dark side. And then later, when I was back in Australia, I did read about the condition of Christians under Islam, so I knew about that. I knew some things. And also, the Acehnese were very proud of fighting the Dutch and fighting other groups. And so they had a proud history of jihad. So the one thing I knew about jihad was the theology, about Islam was the theology of jihad, because it was embedded in the Acehnese psyche and culture.
So jihad is conquest in its broadest terms. So there's an antagonism toward Christians in particular. You're discovering this. You went into some detail of finding out about the life of Muhammad then. What did you discover?
Yeah, that was after 9/11. I realised I knew
Okay,
more.
well, let's go to 2001. 9/11. Why was that a game changer for you in what you thought you needed to know about Islam?
Someone called me up early in the morning. I watched the towers burning, and I knew immediately the one ideology in the world that could do that. And I understood why. And when they were reporting the verses in the backpacks of those bombers, you know, the Quranic verses, I knew them all. And it made sense to me. But I found that everyone around me, it didn't make sense. They said, why would people do that? That's just so weird, you know. And so I thought I'd better do two things. Firstly, I have to explain to people what's happening. And secondly, I need to inform myself. So I went to the library, I took out the Quran, the life of Muhammad, the early biographies of Muhammad. I went to the Islamic Council of Victoria and got books from them. And so I began to inform myself and to teach others. That woke me up. And part of that journey was to read about the life of Muhammad. It's a lot of detailed material. In Islam, Muhammad is the best example. Every person should be like Muhammad. You should love Muhammad. You should want to be Muhammad. You know, the reason why Muslim men wear beards is because Muhammad had a beard. The reason why Muslim women cover themselves is because his wife covered themselves. Whatever he said, you should do. But when I read the life of Muhammad, I was absolutely shocked and appalled, because if he was alive in Australia today, he'd be in prison many times for terrible crimes. And it really distressed my spirit that this man could be considered the best example of almost 2 billion people in the world today.
All right, what are you talking about, Dr. Durie? What on earth did this Muhammad do that warrants the claim that if he was alive and doing that today, he'd be in prison?
Well, some things were small things. For example, one day he became aware that someone was looking through a hole in the wall into his house. So he took a sharp stick and stuck it through the hole. I mean, what sort of person does that?
Not a nice one.
Yeah, and he married. He had this vision about a girl, and he felt he should marry her. She was 6 or 7 at the time,
Aisha.
and he consummated the marriage when she was 9. And as a result of that, in Islamic law, there are rules in textbooks that explain the conditions for marrying a girl who hasn't yet had her first period. And rules in the Quran for what happens if a divorced woman who's not yet had her first period should remarry. And so in many Islamic countries or cultures, there's no kind of minimum age for marriage. So he also, there were some men who'd sort of been Muslims, left Islam, stolen some property. So he had their arms and legs cut off and their eyes put out by red-hot needles and left them in the sun to die. He conquered a Jewish community And there was a man who they thought had stolen or had buried treasure, so they tortured him by burning a fire in his chest, and they chopped his head off. And then Muhammad decided to take his wife as his woman, and she was led to Muhammad's tent past the dead, mutilated body of her husband. And then a Muslim man was marching around his marriage tent during the night as he took this woman and had sex with her. And in the morning, Muhammad said, "Why did you march around my tent, my marriage tent, all night?" And he said, "Well, you killed her father, you killed her brother, you killed all her family. I was worried for your safety." And Muhammad said, "Oh, thank you, that's very kind of you." And you read these things, and it's just, it's shocking.
You don't hear this in the mainstream media. The way Islam presents itself is, and the expression, a religion of peace. That doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, that's a trick, that. I mean, the word Islam means surrender. But there's a related word, salam, which means peace. But this is the surrender of becoming a slave. It actually means to be safe. You make yourself safe by surrendering. It's fundamentally a warfare metaphor, that people are slaves of Allah when they've surrendered to Allah. But that's pretty hard to explain in the West. So you say, oh, it means peace. And so people speak about salvation and peace, but it's actually not. And well, one of the problems with Muhammad is that the life of Muhammad is so unspeakable and bad in many ways.
Because there was that Dutch lady who said exactly what you just said publicly. She was a Dutch academic. And she was censured by the EU for hate speech.
Yeah, I think that's a Swiss woman. Yeah.
Sorry, you're right.
Well,
Swiss.
she said
yes,
Muhammad's
sorry.
a pedophile, and she gave reasons for that. I would never say that. I would just say he married a 9-year-old girl. You don't need to put labels on Muhammad. You just let his story be known. The traditional system was that the people that really only knew that stuff were really quite advanced in Islam. Ordinary Muslims, they just need to know what they need to know. It's a as-needs basis, need-to-know basis. But the problem is, how do you explain that to the world? And a lot of Muslims are leaving Islam now because they're reading these texts for the first time. They're available on the internet. So Islam's kind of being broken open, and it's causing lots of problems for the Muslim world.
We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. If you'd like to see more, hit the subscribe button. For more information about our church, head over to lagana.org.